In the year 405 BC, the island of Sicily was a smoking ruin. The recent offensive by Carthage had created a situation in which the Punic power was now poised to take control of all of Sicily. Only one thing stood in their way: Syracuse. The mighty Greek city-state, which had long resisted their influence, now seemed ready to fall as well. But in this hour of need would rise the hero and tyrant Dionysius, whose bold new leadership would change the course of the war. In this video, we'll cover how Dionysius reforged his city-state to stand out from his rivals and to challenge even mighty Carthage. Another group which rises above the competition is today's sponsor, Kamikoto. They make high-quality Japanese steel knives by using traditional techniques which have been proven over the ages. Each knife is individually inspected and comes with a lifetime guarantee. It's no wonder these Japanese steel knives are used by Michelin star chefs. Now you too can get your hands on a set. As someone who likes to cook, it's honestly been a game changer for me. The knife handles well, even in wet and oily conditions. Delicate fruits and vegetables are cut like butter, and there's no better way to chop. The craftsmanship and artistry of the Kamikoto sets are further enhanced by their heavy-duty ashwood boxes, which make them a great gift. Right now, Kamikoto is running a Black Friday sale and is offering my viewers an extra $50 off any purchase with the discount code Invicta50 on top of their special offer. So click the link in the description or go to kamikoto.com/invicta50 to get your knife set and help support the channel. Enjoy and happy cooking. In Syracuse's darkest hour, it would be saved by an unlikely hero. The man's name was Dionysius. He was a lowly public official who had spent the last few years as a clerk, lost in the bureaucracy of his home city. And yet, the fates decreed a very different thread for his life. When the Second Punic Sicilian War broke out in 410 BC, Dionysius was among those to answer the call to arms. With great ambition and a knack for organization, he quickly worked his way through the ranks. Details are sparse, but it seems that around 409 BC, he had attained significant stature within the army with a string of achievements to his name. This is evidenced by the fact that when Carthage had launched its assault upon Acragas in 406 BC, Dionysius was tapped to join the army command staff. Though Carthage was ultimately victorious, the Syracusans continued to fight a dogged defense of their eroding territory. Eventually, the plague-stricken invaders decided that they had made enough gains and settled a new peace before withdrawing their main force from the island. This was a very delicate time on Sicily, as all knew that Carthage would eventually return to finish the job if given the opportunity. In Syracuse, some considered reconciliation, while others argued for resistance. It was precisely these cracks in the political scene which created an opportunity for Dionysius. The plot he concocted was bold and nefarious. It began by seemingly faking an assassination attempt on his own life. Here, the perpetrator was caught just in time, allowing Dionysius to draw public sympathy and attention. With this supposed threat as an excuse, he was given permission to hire 600 mercenaries for personal protection within the city limits. Shortly thereafter, though, he expanded the armed group to 1,000, staffing it with many loyal followers. At this point, Dionysius now made his moves openly. Cutting through the democratic red tape which had shackled his ambitions, he now deployed his mercenary forces across Syracuse to act as a police force and to seize control. Democratic opposition was silenced and all rebellion was crushed. By 405 BC, Dionysius was now the tyrant of Syracuse. In theory, his largest threat would have been the other Greek communities which might seek to depose him. For instance, Sparta had a history of intervening abroad to topple tyrannical regimes. However, in this case, they actually sent an emissary to strike a deal of mutual support. Sparta, which had previously sided with Syracuse against the Athenians, hoped that the favor might be returned. In exchange, they seem to have given Dionysius the privilege of conscripting mercenaries from the lands under Spartan authority. Thus, with his reign protected at home and on the eastern flank, the tyrant now prepared to turn west against Carthage. But this would be no easy task. In the years that followed, he would further consolidate power and begin an intense period of militarization, which would turn Syracuse into an impregnable fortress. The tyrant now made ready for war. Dionysius would eventually field an army of 80,000 soldiers and a fleet of 200 warships. This enormous force would require mountains of supplies to equip and maintain. Thus it was that one of his most important reforms was the introduction of standardized gear. whereas mercenaries and citizen soldiers had previously been responsible for this kit. Syracuse now sought to create one of the greatest state armories of its era. To this end, we are told that smiths from across Sicily, Italy, Greece, and beyond were commissioned to produce at least 140,000 sets of weapons and armor. In addition, the engineers and carpenters of Syracuse were busy retrofitting the fleet and constructing the new hulking class of quinquereme warships, which were about 20% longer than the standard trireme and carried almost double the number of rowers and marines. In addition, all manner of artillery pieces and siege equipment were assembled. Yet even during this period of preparation, Dionysius did not sit idle within the walls of his city. Syracusan forces mounted escalating raids against the villages and cities of Sicily to probe Carthage's hold on this territory and to begin exerting pressure on the various communities to reconsider their allegiance. By 398 BC, 7 years after taking power, Dionysius was finally ready to make his move. The armies of Syracuse were marshaled and an ultimatum was thrown down. Carthage must abandon its hegemony or prepare for war. Hardly waiting for the inevitable response, the tyrant now launched his invasion. The objective appears to have been to take the Punic stronghold of Motya on the far side of the island before a proper defense could be mounted. Therefore, the Syracusan forces made a rapid advance along the southern coast, leaving a trail of destruction in their path. Carthaginians and collaborators were murdered out of hand, with their property being looted to fill the coffers of the army. Sensing that the winds of change were blowing, opportunistic Sicilians joined the army as it marched. By the time Dionysius reached the gates of Motya in the summer of 398 BC, his army numbered at least 80,000 infantry. The city of Motya was one of the greatest Carthaginian strongholds in Sicily. Founded shortly after the city of Carthage around 800 BC, it was located atop an island inside a natural harbor. As such, it proved a highly defensible and well-connected site, which quickly led to Motya's rise as a great commercial and military center. By the time the Syracusans arrived, it was a formidable city with a full wall, over 20 towers, and several fortified gatehouses. Adding to its protection, the mole, the only way to access the city on foot, had been destroyed by the citizens. Yet this would not deter Dionysius. He now anchored his entire fleet in the bay to cut off the city by sea, whilst tasking his army with the job of rebuilding the mole to prepare for a direct assault if Motya refused to surrender. Some inside may have considered this option. Yet the bloody advance waged by the Syracusans thus far led many to believe that this path would lead to either death or enslavement. Thus, as the noose tightened around Motya, they sent envoys to Carthage, seeking desperate aid. The Phoenicians, meanwhile, were unprepared for the lightning speed with which Dionysius had launched his campaign. The last Carthaginian offensive had taken years of preparation. And yet, realizing that the fall of Motya and in turn Punic Sicily could undo centuries of progress, they now scrambled to summon a response. Himilco, brother of the Hannibal who had led the Second Punic Sicilian War, was appointed command, while a fleet of 100 triremes and tens of thousands of troops were marshaled. These now set off immediately for Motya. Himilco's timing was fortuitous. The Carthaginians managed to catch the forces of Dionysius in the bay, trapping his larger navy in its narrow confines. To make matters worse, the huge transport fleet to the south lay dangerously exposed. Its defenders were overwhelmed, and the nearly 500 ships were either captured or set afire. In theory, the remaining Syracusan ships still outnumbered those of Himilco and featured many of the new, powerful quinqueremes. However, the geography of the bay meant that these could not bring their numbers to bear against the Carthaginians for a breakout. Himilco was thus assured that by holding the mouth of the harbor, he could either win in battle or starve them out. And yet Dionysius was not so easily bested. Using slingers, archers, and his new war machine, the catapult, the Carthaginians were kept at arm's length from his fleet. This allowed him to now begin hauling his ships over the low, flat spit of land to his north. Soon, many Greek warships had been portaged across the strait and could circle around the rear of the Carthaginians. In this way, would their roles be reversed? With the risk of encirclement and annihilation, Himilco was thus forced to retreat back to Carthage. As they sailed off, the citizens of Motya knew that their last hope of rescue had vanished. But this realization also brought with it a great fighting zeal. Though alone, they now prepared for a final stand. Dionysius rose to the challenge by redoubling his efforts to construct the land bridge to the city while covering his operations with the fleet, siege engines, and towers. Finally, these reached the wall and broke through a section. What followed was bloody urban warfare. Here is how Diodorus Siculus describes the scene. Quote, "The Motyans, as they took account of the magnitude of the peril, and with their wives and children before their eyes, fought the more fiercely out of fear for their fate. There were some whose parents stood by, entreating them not to let them be surrendered to the lawless will of victors, who were thus wrought to a pitch where they set no value on life. Others, as they heard the laments of their wives and helpless children, sought to die like men, rather than to see their children led to captivity. Flight, of course, from the city was impossible, since it was entirely surrounded by the sea, which was controlled by the enemy. The battle grew fierce, and abundant reinforcements climbed the ladders, until at last the Sicilian Greeks wore down their opponents by weight of numbers. Straight away, Dionysius' entire army burst into the city, coming also by the mole, and now every spot was a scene of mass slaughter. For the Sicilian Greeks, eager to return cruelty for cruelty, slew everyone they encountered, sparing without distinction not a child, not a woman, not an elder. Dionysius, wishing to sell the inhabitants into slavery for the money he could gather, at first attempted to restrain the soldiers from murdering the captives. But when no one paid any attention to him, and he saw the fury of the Sicilian Greeks was not to be controlled, he stationed heralds to cry aloud and tell the Motyans to take refuge in the temples which were revered by the Greeks. The massacre which unfolded was absolute. In the aftermath, as the campaign season drew to a close, the Syracusan army finished picking the bones of Motya clean before returning home to Syracuse. A small garrison force remained to lay claim to the ashes, while Dionysius drew plans for the next year's ambitious campaigning. But he was not the only one with a taste for blood. The Carthaginians now fully understood the magnitude of the threat at hand and also spent the winter months mustering a massive force. When Dionysius emerged from Syracuse in 397 BC, he was countered by Himilco, who deployed 400 triremes and 50,000 soldiers on the western end of the island. Neither side was immediately prepared for a pitched fight, and instead sought to better position themselves. For Himilco, this meant re-establishing Carthage's authority. Next, he set about lifting the Siege of Syracuse and establishing Punic garrisons to resecure western Sicily. To press matters further, Himilco now made an assault on the eastern side of the island. Sweeping around the northern coast, he collected tribute from Lipara and eventually made a landing at Cape Palorum. This feint drew out the Greek army from Messene, at which point a detachment of the Carthaginian fleet filled with pick rowers and marines quickly sailed around their rear to seize and sack the city. Soon after, the main two fleets would clash at sea in 397 BC at the Battle of Catana. Here, Himilco fielded some 200 triremes and 300 transports retrofitted with rams, while Dionysius deployed a mix of 180 triremes and the new quinqueremes. According to Diodorus Siculus, the naval battle began in the Greeks' favor when their admiral, Leptines, led a sudden sally of an elite force. However, he was ultimately driven to flight, leaving the rest of his fleet leaderless and disorganized in the face of the ensuing Carthaginian counterattack. Though the Greek quinqueremes were larger and far better manned than the Punic triremes, the smaller ships were able to lock them down with grapples and shoot, swarm, or ram them into oblivion. When the battle was finished and the Syracusan fleet crushed, the Carthaginians showed no mercy, sweeping along the coast to kill any Greeks attempting to swim back to shore. Accordingly, the coasts of Sicily became choked with the corpses and broken timbers of the defeated navy. This was a catastrophic defeat for Dionysius. Now on the back foot, he was forced to retreat back within the walls of Syracuse. This was a prudent move. After all, Syracuse was among the largest and most fortified cities in the Greek world. It had withstood the might of the Athenian expedition, and since then had only further been fortified by the ambitious building programs of Dionysius. And yet Himilco was undaunted. He first conducted military and diplomatic operations around eastern Sicily to strip Syracuse of its supporters. Then, he set up his army to choke off its land approaches whilst deploying the fleet to blockade the harbor. A camp was then established to the west of the city, and battle was offered. When the Syracusans refused to emerge, this greatly increased the morale of the attackers. For the next 30 days, they were left to ravage the countryside with impunity. Syracuse would have begun to starve out were it not for their ability to maintain an intermittent supply line from their eastern docks. Thus, the winter months were spent in an uneasy stalemate. But with the arrival of spring came a thawing of this inactivity. Soon, the Carthaginians made probing attacks upon the city and are said to have even penetrated one of its outer districts. yet Syracuse too was able to mount its own sallies, raids, and ambushes. The tide began to shift when the Greeks received crucial food and military convoys and were able to win a series of skirmishes at sea. But the true turning point came with the arrival of the plague. In a similar manner to the Athenians before them, the Carthaginian forces were crippled by this calamity. Now, Dionysius was able to finally make his move. On a moonless night, forces were sent to circle out around the Punic camp and attack it from the rear at first light. At this precise moment, the Greek fleet would sail out en masse to assault the Carthaginian naval positions in the front. This coordinated attack caught Himilco's forces by surprise. Chaos reigned in the camp as units overwhelmed the Punic forts on the hills while cavalry and triremes assailed the anchored fleet along the shore. Dionysius himself was said to have ridden into the fray and helped light the fires which began to spread to the embattled camp. And yet, Himilco's force stood resolute. They managed to recover from the initial shock, maintaining the line and surviving until nightfall. The army may have lived, but the siege of Syracuse was over. From this victory, Dionysius was in a position to destroy the Carthaginians outright. And yet, in the dead of night, he agreed to meet secretly with Himilco to discuss terms of peace. This perplexing move is a fascinating example of the Machiavellian mind of the Syracusan tyrant. It seems that he saw the Carthaginian threat as a useful tool in domestic politics. With the threat effectively neutralized, but not outright removed, Dionysius could continue to use it as leverage against his rivals and any who might challenge his rule. And so, with the addition of receiving a massive bribe of 300 silver talents, he agreed to allow Himilco to sail out with 40 ships bearing only the Carthaginian citizens. When their departure was reported by the Greek sentries, Dionysius made a show of pursuing them, but delayed just enough to allow them to escape. He then led the army to the Punic camp to deal with all who were not protected by the terms of the deal. Having been abandoned, many of the Greek and Sicilian allies melted into the hills. The remaining forces were surrounded. Apparently, the fierce Iberian mercenaries stood ready to fight to the death, but were merely hired by Dionysius using the money from their former commander. The remainder of the Punic army, which included substantial numbers of Libyans, was enslaved. Upon Himilco's return to Carthage, this shameful event caused an uproar. Not only was the army defeated abroad, threatening the strategic control of Sicily, but the abandonment of the allies and mercenaries now threatened the stability of the homeland itself. Indeed, the Libyans soon broke out into revolt. The rebels grew in such numbers that 70,000 of them were said to have besieged the city of Carthage. To make matters worse, a plague was also reported to have swept across Africa. The displeasure of the Carthaginian gods was apparent to all. Himilco, the man held responsible for this chain of disasters, is likely to have been castigated by the court of 104. Our records indicate that while he was not given the traditional punishment of execution by crucifixion, there would be no path for redemption. It was said that the shamed general accepted full responsibility for the disaster, and now took up the robes of a slave, left to shamble to all the temples of the city, begging for forgiveness. In a final act, Himilco then bricked himself into his own home, refusing all aid until he starved to death. How the mighty of Carthage had fallen. Meanwhile, Dionysius in Sicily was at the height of his power. The tyrant now prepared to prosper at his enemy's expense. I hope you found this episode both entertaining and enlightening. Be sure to check out the rest of the episodes in this series. You can also head on over to our Patreon to participate in polls, catch script previews, and get HD downloads of all of our art today. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to our current patrons for funding the channel, and to our researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. We certainly couldn't have done it without this team and this community. So be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other related episodes. See you in the next one.